Thank you for joining us today on the start of the last day of Reboot. Appreciate you all dragging yourself out of bed for this. I think it's going to be worthwhile.
We hope so.
I'm joined by Amy Hennig, of course. We're going to be having a pretty wide-ranging discussion about Amy's career and the future of games and where we might be going with narrative and a few other things. We're going to take 10 to 15 minutes at the end to take some questions from the crowd as well. So if anything does come up that you want to ask about, please do sit and think about some questions and get your hands up towards the end. We're going to go straight into a break afterwards, so I think we might be able to overrun a minute, but I haven't actually asked permission for that. So if we get hustled off stage, then that's why. Amy, let's just start with a quick introduction to yourself. I'm sure everyone knows who you are, but a little bit of your history. I was looking into your biography, doing some research.
Did you want on Wikipedia? I don't recommend that. I don't even know what's on there. I've never looked at it.
Well, the thing that struck me really was I didn't realize what a polymath you were and had all the kind of different roles that you'd served in the industry, especially in your early career.
Yeah.
I mean, you kind of ran the gamut of pretty much every kind of creative aspect of game making, right?
Yeah, to some degree, everything but programming. Although I was technically inclined and had to understand it to a certain degree, I never was a coder. But I started as a junior artist. Sorry, my voice is going to be wrecked, of course, as all of ours are. I didn't bring any lozenges. That wasn't smart of me. And so I studied a bit of animation, and I was a competent artist, not by hand, but when we could rely on pixels and computers, and you didn't have to actually have any traditional skills. So I started at Electronic Arts. Actually, I did an Atari game in 1989, and then got a real job at EA in 1991 as a junior artist and an animator, animating little pixel dudes for Bard's Tale 4, which never came out. Obviously, they've since made a Bard's Tale 4, so these things eventually happen. And then moved into design, and then lead design, and then directing, and that's where the writing came in. So it's good. In the role of a creative director, it's really great to be able to understand all the other disciplines, at least sort of like nominally, so that you can communicate cross-discipline and kind of connect the dots. I often say that I think the biggest trait that a creative director needs is to be a holistic thinker, and that also goes for, understanding all the disciplines and being able to talk, intelligently about all of it.
Yeah, I think that kind of that generalism is a useful thing to have in the arsenal for any manager, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, you're probably the thing people would know you best for is the Uncharted series most recently.
Probably,
yeah. I mean, that was a fascinating series, not just because of the quality of the game itself, but because it spanned a really interesting period, I think, in the industry's history. We talked a little bit the other night about the way that things changed between the first and the last of those games that you worked on. The evolution of the game itself, the way that the narrative worked. Where do you think that goes next? We were talking about the relative simplicity of the linear progression of narrative, and then moving on to things like Bandersnatch and open-ended narrative stuff. I mean, where do you see that kind of push moving next?
Such a short question. short answer, I should say. No, I'll just talk for the rest of the hour. Well, it's fascinating on so many levels because. So again, I started on the Atari 7800, and it was so limited at that point. And then, even moving through, I worked on at Crystal Dynamics for 8 years on Legacy of Kain and Soul Reaver, and then at Naughty Dog for about 10 and a half, working on Uncharted and Jack 3 before that. But, we always would kind of marvel at the fact that even over the course of, from Uncharted to Last of Us, that was all on the PlayStation 3. And if you hold those two games next to each other, and just in terms of like content and visual fidelity and quality and just sort of competency of what we were doing, I mean, we learned so much in that amount of time. But what we were talking about the other night is just how much... we're sort of at an interesting crossroads in the industry, and obviously I'm at a sort of a personal crossroads in terms of figuring out where I want to land next, and I feel like those two things are related a little bit. I'm giving you a very meandering answer to your question.
It's a pretty meandering
It's my prerogative. And so, you look at an Uncharted 1, and that game, was single player only. Obviously there were some unlockables, but there was no online or multiplayer. Probably could complete it in 8 or 9 hours. It depends on the player, right? And then you compare that against Uncharted 4, which is double the size. Same thing for God of War 1 versus God of War 2018. The same thing for an Insomniac game from the mid-2000s to Spider-Man, right? Across the board, we've doubled everything in size. We've also doubled our development times and doubled our team sizes, and probably more than doubled in these cases too. And yet our price point hasn't changed. And so some of the pressures and the controversies that we see inside the industry are coming from that, right? The fact that the scope of what we're working on has increased to such a huge degree, but the price point of our product hasn't. And nobody wants that to go up, right? Because I think that there's a reason we were always at that price point, even back in the cartridge days, right? Is that once you get past that, it feels like a much bigger commitment or investment or purchase, right? But that's why I think you see a lot of things happening inside the game industry around games as service and trying to keep people in the ecosystem of your game and be able to continually monetize them. That's why you see the rise of loot boxes, and like a lot of the things that we complain about, but we can kind of see where it came from. And a lot of it came from the pressures of, sort of the GameStop, not to just lay it entirely at their feet, but, sort of the GameStop phenomenon, which is if you made a finite game, it was perceived as a rental. Kind of online forums would say, just rent it, or buy it used, or buy it and sell it back. And so you see, the publisher's response was, well, how do we create value, or even sometimes just the illusion of value, right? And that's where you see games with multiplier tacked on, right? Was this that it was trying to create this illusion of value that if you haven't finished the game or there's more to it, then you don't want to trade it in, and so you're going to keep it on your shelf. And so a lot of where we're at now in terms of kind of scope and complexity and cost was sort of self-inflicted. So again, very kind of broad response to your question, but the idea that we've changed from kind of intentionally creating these finite experiences to creating experiences that just don't end, right? And so for me, just very personally as a storyteller, it's a very weird place to be, right? Because for me, story by definition is finite, right? And intentionally authored. It's not something that just happens through a series of events that unspool procedurally, right? And it has a deliberate end, right? It has landmarks and a deliberate end. And kind of the Aristotle's principles of like, the story concludes in a way that is both completely surprising, but also completely inevitable. Well, again, that doesn't happen by accident.
Yeah.
So when we're in a world where we're not even making finite games, or when we are, they're 20, 40, 100 hours, and the common wisdom is most players don't finish them, right? I mean, that's just, we have these statistics inside the industry, is that some games or some publishers, like they realize 10% of their audience is going to see the entire story. And that's kind of like upsetting, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, particularly for creators. I mean, I know there's dozens, if not hundreds, of worlds that I've allowed to be consumed by hellfire or destroyed by evil maniacs, or people hostages I've never rescued and stuff. That's kind of that worries at you after a while. But for a creator, it must be pretty frustrating, right? To pour your heart and soul into something, particularly when you're working on a multi-game arc like Uncharted, and you're developing these characters and bringing them through this kind of saga almost of sort of self-contained stories. To see people kind of leaving those halfway. We were talking the other night about if that happened in cinema. If you're sitting in a theater and someone gets up 30 minutes into the film, is just like, this is too hard for me, or another film's just come out next door and I'm going to go and watch that instead. Right? That just doesn't happen, right?
Right. And again, I mean, when I say this, it sounds like somehow it's being laid at the player's feet, like, why aren't they finishing our precious stories? And I don't mean it that way at all. What I'm saying is, look, I as a gamer am finding that I'm so drawn to the games that we're making now, but I know I will never get to the end of them. I just don't have the time. We're sort of loath to talk about this as longtime gamers, because it seems like when you talk about feeling a little sort of distanced or disenfranchised from your own longtime hobby, that it feels like you're turning in your gamer card, or somehow like losing your gamer cred. But privately, my entire group of gamer friends, and colleagues, we all privately kind of confess to each other that we're sort of overwhelmed by our own hobby.
Yeah.
and again, this is sometimes this gets misinterpreted as somehow a dogmatic call to arms or a response to go like, we shouldn't be making these games. Of course we should, right? I think what dismays me right now, it doesn't feel like we're making the whole spectrum of games that we could be making. At least not in sort of mainstream publishing, developing AAA, right? Everything is just kind of doubled down on mega blockbusters, which are way more massive in scope than they used to be in terms of the commitment of resources and time and money. And so they are all Hail Mary bets now, right? So where you're seeing smaller bets being made is in the indie space, which fascinates me. And I'm finding myself as a longtime gamer seeking out the finite experiences that I can find, on Steam or games that are being published by arent, things like that, where I'm finding the greatest reward in playing games from that space, even though I am absolutely dumbstruck with admiration for what these big games that have been winning awards this year. God of War and and Spider-Man and Red Dead and all these games. I am full of admiration for them, but there's also this sort of sense of regret that I know that I'll probably never really get to experience them fully. Yeah. And then as a creator, I think about how that would make me feel if I had created those games, knowing that only a small fraction of people were really going to see the arc of the thing I made.
Yeah, I think it's partly, it's certainly, as you say, it's partly about growing older and having a little bit less time to be self-indulgent with hobbies. I mean, I think everyone's got that kind of pile of shame somewhere in their house where they've gone out on into a bookshop or someone's recommended something and, they've got volumes of Tolstoy or, other great work sat there, and then they come down to actually sit down to read and they pick up a 200-page sci-fi novel because they know they can finish it in a week and it's self-contained and done and it's easy and it's fun.
Well, what's fascinating is at the same time, those of us in the interactive entertainment industry have been pushing toward larger and larger experiences and sort of, games of service and sort of unending experiences. You see on the other end of the spectrum in linear media, in film and television, traditional, film and TV studios are looking at how to create even more bite-sized content. Because of this problem, it's not about age. It's not about as we get older, we have less time. Certainly, I mean, once you have other responsibilities and children and all that kind of stuff, it's harder. But I think we all feel that way, even single people in their 20s. It's just there's so much competing for our time and attention. And we're sort of constantly distracted, right? The traditional media's response to that is try to figure out how to actually create content that's more digestible, which is why we, even on Netflix, even though we're seeing episodic, television episodes and things like that, and because there's no limitation of commercial time, they could be going to longer episodes, but they're still sort of sticking to the 22 minutes and 45 minutes, partly because that's what we're used to, but also because that's what's digestible. And then we have the phenomenon of people binging, but we go into it going not like, well, I'm going to sit down and watch 10 hours of Stranger Things. You go, I'll watch an episode. Yeah. And then next thing you know, it's Sunday and you're still in your pajamas and you watch the entire thing, right? And we do the same thing in games. If you think about it, that's actually how Uncharted was structured, right? Each of those chapters is about the size, and this wasn't exactly intentional. I think it was just sort of gut instinct as writers that each of the chapters is sort of about the size of a half hour of television or about an hour of television, meaning about that sort of 22 to 25, 45 to 55 minutes. And so there's an opportunity at each of those breaks for the player to go, okay, that's good, more tomorrow, or go, oh, one more, and then again, suddenly it's Sunday and you're still in pajamas and you've played the whole game, right? But nobody is creating something intentionally going, open wide, here's 10 hours of television, right? Because this audience would go, I can't. Yeah. But in games, we are going, oh, you got to play Red Dead. It gets really good about 30 hours in, and it's about, it's when people tell me that, I just die inside. I don't have 30 hours. Yeah. So it's fascinating to me. And then that connects to something else we were talking about, which is, what's going to happen when we see the convergence of media? Because that's what's happening, I believe, is we're going to see a blend and a convergence between traditional linear media and interactive media, and the lines between are going to be completely blurred. And so when we see this sort of, entertainment at these two poles now, where do we land, right?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting vergence of a lot of that. I mean, particularly with the psychology of humans and the kind of time frames of enjoyment they have, this kind of stuff that's almost hardwired. That's almost been taken to the nth degree with mobile games and the examination of the science of feedback loops and having those, like 12 milliseconds, and then the different gates of enjoyment where you have the response to your action becoming a useful thing and how that's expanded. And I think that's partly leads into what we were talking about when we were talking about Bandersnatch and the idea of those that kind of transmedia stuff and broadening audiences by bringing games into situations that people are more familiar with and allowing them to enjoy stuff there. I mean, Bandersnatch was an interesting example in that I think it reached a lot of people who didn't particularly play a lot of games.
Yeah.
Most of the people I know who were really into games thought, it's kind of okay, kind of gets halfway and isn't satisfying. And I think one of the key things that they found about that was they were getting this kind of FOMO of stuff we were talking about. You get those choices come up, and people who play games are so used to being able to go, okay, I'm going to explore this branch, but I'm probably going to save it there and go back and explore the other thing.
Yeah.
And it was interesting that it really focused on pressuring people, seeing timeless go down, like choices of real note, into making those branching narrative decisions. And that's an interesting pressure to put on a consumer.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, too, when we talk about the fact that I think people want to know what they're getting into. They may end up binging 10 hours of content, but they see that they're able to parcel that out for themselves or just get sucked in, right? So it was interesting. I played through Bandersnatch 3 different times, but twice, once myself and twice watching other people play. And what was interesting is I think that it confounded that sense of wanting to know that what you were committing to, because you didn't know if it was going to be 40 minutes, an hour, 90 minutes, depending on how you played. And I think some of what happened for people is when they hit those Groundhog Day moments where you get kicked back in time, there's a little bit of not only that sense of, I failed, but also, well, how long is this going to go on? Whether they were enjoying it or not, you just didn't know whether you're like, we got another 20 minutes, or we could be here all night, right? And I think that doesn't feel good to people. And so what's interesting about Bandersnatch to me, and I love the fact that it exists, and we talked about a little bit whether, and I enjoyed the experience, but from my experience, and this is even a criticism of what Netflix is doing, because I admire them trying to get into this space, is from my experience with Uncharted and then working on the Star Wars game, it's backwards, right? Like, we want, I think, as consumers of story, receivers of story, we want to be told a confident, intentional, authored narrative that has setups and payoffs, and it has twists and turns and anchor points and landmarks, and then lands in the way we described, right? And so what's weird to me, and then we did it in Uncharted, is we gave you agency between those points, right? Everyone's going to come to the same story pinch point because there's an authored narrative that's unfolding. But between those, we tried to give you as much little micro choices as possible so you felt like you were freestyling your own experience, right? In a way, weird analogy, I guess, but that's kind of what Florence is, right? Everyone's going to actually play through the same story, but your tactile emotional experience with the game is unique to you, right? And is moving because you actually had a relationship via the controls with the game. You look at a Bandersnatch or any sort of streaming video thing, and the reason I say it feels backwards is that we are passively watching the part that we would normally be playing, and then we're altering the part that we want to be confidently and intentionally authored.
Yeah.
And so I think that gives you a little sense of dilution. Now, look, that can be done well. And obviously there was sort of a meta story, a very Black Mirror meta story, a self-referential thing going on with Bandersnatch, which worked for that, that application. But, so this is only possible through real time, right? And this is where I think the revolution comes, is if we agree that the rapid, or the wide and rapid adoption of 5G is inevitable, and if we agree that that means that in the same way that music streaming and television and film and video streaming became inevitable, real-time streaming. And I'm calling it real-time streaming instead of game streaming because I think the game streaming is too limited of a way to describe it. That real-time streaming is also inevitable. We can debate about how many years we think this is going to happen in. 2 to 5, more, right? Depends on who you talk to. Now, we also know that to make games, it can take 2 to 5 years, so maybe we better get on it if it's going to be 2 to 5 years, right? But what that's going to mean is, not only that will that potentially radically change games, changes our business models, it changes the players in the space, it changes the kind of content we can create. These are the good and bad things that we have to be like kind of get ahead of. It also changes the audience, right? And that's why I like the fact that Bandersnatch exists, because it is the best model of frictionlessly easing non-gamers into interactive content, right? The fact that you're already on a subscription service you're paying for, so no extra cost. You don't need to pick up a controller or not be intimidated by one, because that's a huge friction point, right? You're just in Netflix, and then you click over, and the thing's got a little icon on it, and you're in. And now you are interacting with the story. So, and that was fairly cool, even with the branching video. Imagine how revelatory that would be to an audience of non-gamers who are being introduced to real-time content for the first time.
I would love to have seen people who didn't even realize what Bandersnatch was going into that, you know, just thinking, oh, hey, it's a new Charlie Brooker thing. I love Black Mirror, cool. And going into that and kind of just suddenly realizing and being drawn into that experience without even realizing that they were starting to sort of play a game and how they felt about that towards the end of stuff. Because I think that's one of those barriers to entry, right? There's gaming, the gatekeepers of gaming have set up this kind of fortress around the hobby, saying like, "Oh no, you probably wouldn't like this. It's not for you."
Right.
You know.
And like, so that's one of the reasons I think this is going to be controversial, right?
Yeah.
Inevitable. I mean, I think we're headed for some. Sorry about that. Headed for some major change in exciting ways and in worrisome ways. Things that we're going to have to kind of overcome. And some of that is how we define our own hobby.
Yeah.
And whether we as gamers are tending to want to see our hobby and this thing that we love as being elite, as opposed to something for everyone. I mean, you see already there's a lot of, I mean, it's very current, right? There's a lot of debate around, you know, accessibility and difficulty, and, you know, whether we should be trying to make these experiences accessible to everyone. And we need to separate out the accessible question, which is just being good humans and making sure that, you know, people that might have disadvantages are able to play games, right? And then the difficulty question, which is, of course, rising out of Sekiro, right?
Yeah.
That by dumbing down the game to include more people for whom it's too difficult, are you actually altering the core experience? And I'm of two minds on that myself, right? But the thing is when I think about this potential of this new marketplace, we have to be open to the idea that we can welcome more people into our hobby. And the challenge, I think, of looking at the potential, I hate using the word market because it sounds so kind of mercenary, you know, this potential wider audience, right? The people we can reach who are being unserved by interactive content. I don't believe they're non-gamers. Yeah. I just think that there's the semantics around that word are complicated.
Yeah, it's not like they hate fun, right?
It's got baggage, right? No, they play tabletop games, they play mobile games. I mean, the irony is people turn on Netflix and then play a game on their phone at the same time, so they're gamers, right? But really, this isn't about trying to convince them that they're gamers or convert them and pull them to where we are. I think it's incumbent on us to meet them where they are with what we know how to do, right? Because I'll tell you, everybody in Hollywood, every TV and film studio has an interactive division. They are going to be on this, and they don't actually know how to do what we know how to do. Now, one could argue that in terms of story and character, they have a lot longer track record than we have, and probably are more adept in many ways because that's the core of their business. They don't understand real time at all. Developing for, you know, content for a real-time application, because why would they, right? And they certainly don't understand interactivity. They don't have our experience. And so if you imagine story, real time, and interactivity as this Venn diagram, that those of us who can actually operate at a high level in all three of those spheres have a great opportunity right now to get in there and define that space for a wider audience. Because if we don't do it, other people are going to.
Yeah.
And we should have the humility to not go, here's the games we've been making, open wide, here, become a gamer. We really should be crafting experiences for them. And look, you're seeing this happening more, I think, in the independent space, right? Mm-hmm. Games that aren't about all the intimidating factors for a mainstream audience, that are about mastery and difficulty and conquering. I mean, we often joke about the fact that, games are the only medium we talk about beating.
Yeah.
We don't go, I beat the most amazing book. Let me tell you about it. Did you beat that movie last weekend? That was amazing, that movie.
Last chapter was a real toughie.
Right,
7 or 8 times in, and I got it.
But I beat it, And that's funny, right? I mean, like humorous and also peculiar that's our relationship with this medium. Now, granted, it's because obviously games traditionally have been about competition, but we need to widen the way we think about games to be thinking about them as experience. And that doesn't require difficulty, competition, mastery, fail states, setbacks. And I'm not saying, again, because I'm not a dogmatic person, it's more about wanting to widen our sphere more. That when we get dogmatic about thinking, well, if it doesn't have this, it's not a game, right? Because obviously games like, Celeste and Fortnite and PUBG, I mean, all these things should exist, right? Games that are more about competition and difficulty and mastery, even the games that I've made, right? But what happens is, that makes them not accessible to this wider audience. Mm. And again, so there may be some in our hobby that would go, sure, that's fine. If, it's this whole get good thing, right? Like, if you can't hang, this isn't for you. So there's sort of this exclusive attitude about our medium and our hobby that I don't think is actually healthy.
Yeah.
And so we have to be open to the idea that we can create content that isn't about fail states and difficulty. It's about a journey and an experience. And like, you think about kind of what we cracked with Uncharted and games like that, we're 90% of the way there, right? It's just sort of adjusting a little bit to go, can we make content like this for an audience that wouldn't necessarily buy a PS4 or want to pick up that, 15-plus button controller? Like, we create so many frictions because, again, it's the walled hobby, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's an aspect of games that wants to stay that way, of course, right? That's not going to go away. The question is can we sort of widen our horizons?
Yeah.
And take what we know how to do and actually be first to market in this place where other people are going to try to come in and clumsily do something, and they're going to put a stink on the whole thing because they don't actually know how to do what we know how to do.
Yeah.
Right?
But I think that comes nicely full circle to the first thing we were talking about how we deal with the idea that we are, if we want to progress the medium, we're going to need to be having bigger budgets, wider teams. You're going to need more artists, more writers, more technical people doing stuff. Mm-hmm. And really the only way to do that and support that growing budget, if we're not going to put the cost of a game up, is to widen the audience and sell more of those games at the same price. It was interesting to see with the Google Stadia announcement at GDC, one of the key points of their presentation, when they were talking directly to developers, was sort of saying, this opens up entirely new audiences for you. This gets rid of the cost of entry for buying a console. This means that anyone who's sat there watching a YouTube video can just press a button and in 5 minutes they can be playing your game.
Right.
And it was interesting to see them, I think probably to counterbalance that a little bit in terms of their presentation and thinking about the way where they were representing that and the audience they were talking to at that point. They presented that with very traditional games experiences.
Yeah.
There was Assassin's Creed was the kind of thing they really showed off for that, so saying you can jump into this story. And I think actually for that's not a great example of what they were trying to do with that first point, right? You're not going to sell Assassin's Creed necessarily to somebody who's not interested in all the games they've seen advertised on TV.
Although if they were interested, they would have already made the purchase, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So
where
do you think that goes next?
Well, I think it's wise to be able to test out your your platform with existing content rather than, enduring the delay of development to build bespoke content. But of course, they and others are doing that at the same time. The question is what is then communicated to the potential audience about what we may be making for them. And I think that what's weird to me is I see these announcements and go, this is amazing. So real-time content streamed directly into our homes, into our devices, just like TV and film is now. And it's like, that's mind-blowing, but then I see everything being just defined as game streaming. And it's like, well, then that's just an invisible console. Like, you're not pointing at any bigger audience. It's just the same people that are already buying your hardware. It comes with benefits, but it seems so limited in thinking. And then, Google and others talk about how they can 10x their audience, right? Because we'll be able to reach so many more people. But then the next beat of that conversation has to be about content.
Yeah. Not
about just having access to them now, so we're going to shove the content we've been making at them. Because again, if they were into those experiences, they'd already be on board, right? Yeah. And what I was saying before about finding sort of these smaller experiences through other publishers or other means, a lot of these games, whether it's like a Florence or a Return of the Obra Dinn or Edith Finch, these things already have no fail states, right? So this is not a new idea. The problem, and I think these games would actually have huge appeal to this audience that we're talking about. There's zero discoverability, right? Which is a problem in our industry already, right? We don't do a very good job of being able to kind of lay out the content that is available. If you don't know to search for it, you probably wouldn't find it. Or if you weren't reading forums or following a whole bunch of gaming people on Twitter, you wouldn't know. So there's no way to potentially discover something if you're not already in those areas, right? And so it's critical that we figure out how these services can be Trojan horsed. Again, that sounds so manipulative, but you know what I mean. Can be Trojan horse right to this audience, as well as gamers. Look, because if we do our job right, it's not like we're excluding people who are playing traditional games. We're sort of saying it's for everybody, right? And I would hope we could use as examples of that the people, mainstream gamers are enjoying the kind of games I just described, which, are about the experience. And I feel like we're not giving this audience credit. And I feel like we have the benefit of being able to draw on a phenomenon that we saw in our industry that wouldn't necessarily have been visible or remarkable to people outside our industry, which is games like Uncharted and Until Dawn. Supermassive's Until Dawn had the same effect, and other games have as well. And actually, I've heard stories about people having the same effect with Detroit, Quantic Dream's Detroit, is that the non-gamers in the family are just as invested in the game as the gamer. Yeah. And we heard, not just anecdotally, but consistently, people would say, yeah, my wife, my spouse, my parents, my kids, whatever, they would say, don't play that game without me. Don't you dare play that game without me. I want to see what happens next. And they didn't just mean, I want to watch it like a TV show. They were collaborating. It was an interactive experience for them, because they were invested in all the good verbs that we do in some of these genres, which are mystery and discovery and problem solving and sort of, the big vistas and the puzzles and all this content, as well as the story and the characters, and making that engaging, right? Both, I think, Uncharted in the adventure space and Until Dawn in the horror space had the benefit of being able to lean into sort of well-loved tropes, which is inclusive, I think, of a big audience. But when I see that phenomenon of those people being just as invested in the experience as the gamer in the family, I look at that and go, A, why are we not designing for that intentionally rather than just stumbling into it, right? And B, why are we not making content for those people instead of putting it behind the gates of, well, if you don't want to buy an expensive console, if you don't even know how to turn it on. I mean, the people in my family, look, I can't even tell the difference on the PS4 between the power and the disc eject buttons. It's like the USB thing.
Time,
like,
right?
it's like, I have to get reading glasses and go see it. So, I mean, we don't make it easy, right? And that's certainly the controller, unfortunately, even though we've gotten to a point where it's this well-crafted thing for us, it's an absolute non-starter
Yeah.
for this audience.
Yeah, yeah.
And you can't just say, well, what if we only use 2 of the buttons? Doesn't matter. It's the device is intimidating.
It's like
right?
being given a time bomb and go, well, you only need to
Right.
cut 2 of the wires. It's
Right.
like, well, there's 50 of
Yes,
them.
yes,
So,
yeah, but only this one. Yeah, and so to me, I mean, obviously, we've seen some inroads in this. Is that what we have Trojan horsed into people's lives are smartphones, right? Everyone has that in their pocket. It is an analog input device that we all have and are familiar with, from 2-year-olds to our grandparents, right?
Yeah.
Why are we not using that as an input device for this audience, right? So just thinking about what are those barriers, what are those obstacles, what are those frictions that would have them go, never mind, right? Particularly because they're already going to have to go, well, real-time rendered look, even though we can make things pretty damn photoreal these days, right? They might go, I'm not sure if that's for me. Is that a cartoon? Is that a game? I don't know. The interactivity, they might go, I don't play games, right? So you already are going to have to ease them into the idea of it, so let's not throw obstacles at them about, mastery and difficulty. And again, I know this is a minefield, especially with the conversation that's going on, online these days. And, and I always want to be careful to try to, carefully parse my words, because none of this is a critique of what we do. I'm just looking at what we're going to have to do if we want to try to reach this wider audience. And there would probably be some who would be more extreme that would go, well, we don't care about them. They're just, they're not the hardcore gaming fans, and why would we cater to them? And I think there's probably going to be some existential concern that will be instead of creating the kind of games that are being made. And I don't believe that.
Yeah.
I just think it's an and, not an instead.
Yeah, that odd territorial kind of thing of sort
Yeah.
of saying, well, don't take my games from me. It's like, no, there are
Well, it's a
always
big piece
people
of
making
people's
this.
identities,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right, and then we have to be sensitive to that. That, I mean, look at even just during the console wars, people would just get rabid with each other about whether they were an Xbox fanboy or PlayStation, which of course is just madness to me. But we have to understand the fact that this is deeply ingrained for people.
Yeah, I mean, not that different from supporting a sports team, right?
It's exactly
kind of
that, right.
Cathartic tribalism that, it's super important to
It's
people,
just
and
human
it's not
nature,
to be dismissed.
right?
Yeah.
But I just think that we dismiss the potential market and audience and what it could do for our art form if we batten down the hatches and get tribal about it.
Listen, I think we could talk about this all day, and I'd love to, but we should probably take some time.
I can. This is what I do for a living now, is talk about this all day.
Yeah, you just got
It doesn't
a free
pay well,
45-minute
I'll warn you.
consultancy. So.
Yes, right, yeah.
Listen, we should take some questions from the audience. We've got about 10 minutes before we officially go into the break, but I think we might be able to sneak an extra couple of minutes onto that if we ask nicely. Anybody got any questions to kick us off? Just put your hands up, and there'll be a microphone that comes around, and we can get into something.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was really fantastic. I was wondering what your feelings are about difficulty with respect to kind of games as a spectator sport with regards to things like Twitch and previously Let's Plays and things like that. If there's a way to reach a wider audience, and kind of non-gamers through almost an analog of sport. Through watching people do these kind of things, if that's anything that you've thought about, or how that factors into the ecosystem that you're describing.
Yeah, I haven't thought about that too much, honestly, just because in my realm, the esports stuff hasn't really been that much of an issue, obviously, being focused on single player and narrative. But look, I do think there's potentially a much bigger audience as the fidelity of these experiences improves, and it doesn't feel like you don't know what you're looking at, right? If you're not a player, you wouldn't understand what you're looking at. I think there's going to be the opportunity for some of these things to be spectator sports for a much wider audience. But I think some of the content now probably wouldn't have an appeal, just thinking about it, just because if you don't understand all the what you're seeing pop up on the HUD and what the players are doing, and a lot of times the animation's kind of janky because we don't care, right? It's the gameplay experience, but unless you actually are you understand that game, you probably wouldn't enjoy watching it. But I can imagine a lot of things. Actually, I had some friends, unfortunately, the company is no more, but they started a company called Outpost Games, and they were doing a game called SOS, which was kind of meant to be almost like a competitive, real-time, online, I'm probably going to misrepresent it, so I'm cringing already, but almost like you were watching a Survivor type show, meaning that in the same way we get invested in those competitions, that you could see it being, a real-time version of that. Of course, we stumble a little bit when it comes to fidelity and what people might be saying into their mics, and it's complicated. But I think as we figure that stuff out, I think in the same way that we watch reality TV and reality competition shows on television, we'll see real-time game versions of those being watched by a wider audience.
I think there's an interesting aspect to that as well about whether it's a useful thing for the industry. We spoke a little bit the other night about the things like Let's Plays and the Twitch streaming of purely narrative games, and whether those basically essentially end up representing lost sales, right? Because it's kind of like going around to a friend's house to watch a movie. If 10 people watch it in one place, then they're not all going to go home and rent it themselves. And
there's different views on that, right? Like I would think, again, from the publishers, some of their existential threat was, well, if people just watch these things being played, so it sort of replaced the GameStop question. It's sort of like, well, if this is fairly linear and someone could just watch somebody else playing it, we lose a sale, right? And so on the publisher side, that's kind of how they see it, I think, a lot of times. But a lot of developers say, actually, we see those are converting into sales. Even games that are fairly linear, if it's compelling to watch, people go, well, I want to experience that, and they often go purchase it. And again, the question is when we get into like streaming subscription services, look, this is fraught with potential peril too. I mean, look, streaming music hasn't been great for the music industry, and there's a lot of stuff, there's some cautionary tales there that we should learn from in terms of business models, protecting ourselves as creators. I worry when I hear people talking about that we monetize potentially through subscription models by, minutes of engagement or minutes played, which will absolutely destroy our ability to open up a wider spectrum of content. Because you'll just see more things like games of service than just moving over to subscriptions.
Yeah. And it crushes something like Florence, which takes an hour and is a beautiful one-off time.
Right, and needs to exist, right? Yeah. And actually, I think is the kind of thing that would appeal to this audience if they had any discoverability, right, for it. So, sorry, I went off on a whole different tangent there. So I mean, I think we have to be really careful to go, well, how many subscription services are going to be out there? Are we going to end up monetizing it the wrong way that actually still kind of inhibits creativity or variety? And are we going to have business models that don't allow us to be as successful? Well, if we agree that this all is going to be inevitable, we better figure that out, because it'll get figured out for us, right?
Absolutely. Other questions over there?
Yeah.
Hi.
Thanks for your talk. I'm wondering what you think about as we move towards more immersive technologies and multi-sensory technologies with VR and AR, how you think that will affect how we tell stories when we're able to bring more of our physical selves into digital spaces.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, the cool thing about VR and AR is that the inputs need to be organic and gestural and intuitive, right? And so that immediately actually opens it up to a wider audience. I don't know. Look, this is all just my personal sort of gut opinion, and it changes all the time, right? I've been exploring VR over the last year or two. Is that unfortunately VR is a fairly isolating experience. And so I think that some of the reason that, besides the technical reasons or the fidelity reasons, the content reasons, it maybe hasn't taken off with a wider audience, is that it just seems like something you do alone. I've said kind of crassly that it feels a little masturbatory to put the headset on, and go, sorry family, I'm doing this in the living room. And it's like, that's like you should go in the other room and do that. Whereas AR obviously is far more inclusive, right? Like we can see each other, you can go out in the world, right? So I think that in the same way that, the iPhone, smartphones, just was the huge tipping point in terms of value for what we were asking people to do to extend themselves and explore new technology, even if you're 80 years old or 90 years old. We just need to find the same thing in AR, VR, that people see such a reward for trying it that it then becomes widespread. Now, there's a whole Black Mirror future here that I dread, obviously, but I think that we're going to see more interesting applications in AR first, probably. And I know, obviously, there's some big players that are very secretly readying some probably pretty impressive technology that we'll all go, I must have, right? I think trying to figure out how you do storytelling in AR in the world is a little harder than VR, which is a little bit more obvious because it's immersive. But it's an interesting challenge. I'm not sure it's one I'm going to take on, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think VR certainly represents some interesting opportunities for asymmetric play, for things like Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes.
Yeah.
I thought was a really interesting avenue to take that down, that kind of using that isolation as a positive thing and turning it into a multiplayer experience. But there don't seem to have been a lot of other projects which has gone down that road.
No, I mean, look, it's just such early days, it's one of the reasons I'm fascinated by it, and I bought all of the VR systems and have them all set in my office, because it reminds me, like, I got into games in the first place because I was in film school getting my master's, and I dropped out to go into games, because getting that first job just to make money in games, I kind of realized it was a frontier in the same way we were studying all these early filmmakers like, Georges Méliès, the Lumière brothers, and Sergei Eisenstein, and all these people that were defining the language of film. That's how games seem to me. Well, that's how VR seems to me too. There's a real enticement to go, well, how cool would it be to be, the Georges Méliès of VR, right? To figure out what it means to tell stories in VR. So we really haven't cracked it yet. But there's not really a great business model, so it's a tough road to hoe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. A bit of a more traditional design question. When it comes to more traditional games like Uncharted, the Uncharted series, how do you tackle the correlation between narrative moments and gameplay, like in terms of a traditional movie tangent time graph against a gameplay pacing graph? Like, how do you make big gameplay moments related to narrative ones?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's always a tension, right? That there's sometimes gameplay wins and sometimes narrative wins, and ideally they sing and they're in harmony, right? But the thing is, for a game like that, like with Uncharted, and then I was doing the same thing with Star Wars, is that fundamentally, if you are homaging a type of cinema, then what you do is you deconstruct that genre, you deconstruct that medium, figure out what all of the tropes and the verbs are, what all the story landmarks are, and then you reconstruct it in an interactive context, right? And so that means when you're laying out the game, you're looking at where are my act breaks, right? Where's my big downturn? Where does this element come in sort of story structure? Because sometimes we'll look at all of them, and none of these things you have to adhere to. It's just nice to look at traditional act structure, Robert McKee and Save the Cat. I mean, that's a controversial one, but don't take him too seriously. There's some good thoughts in there, but, this must happen on page 10 is ridiculous. Or Joseph Campbell, right? And we look at all of those things because they resonate with us. This is fundamental to this is how we receive story as human beings, right? And then you go, okay, well, what is that in the game? So, in the same place you would have a big climactic action moment in a film, well, we do the same thing in the game. And it's sort of percentage-wise mapped out the same way as it would be if you were looking at a film. And then if you think about the way stories are told, and then particularly like action films, really fundamentally what it comes down to is this sort of repeating loop of three things: events, objectives, and sequences, right? So an event, something happens, right? You're attacked, you're ambushed, your friends are captured, you're captured, I could go on, right? And then that gives you a new objective. Okay, escape, rescue, sabotage, chase, pursue, right? Again, it could go on. And then that defines the next sequence, and that's where your gameplay is, right? So what is that? Okay, my friend's been captured, so my goal is rescue them. I need to infiltrate, right? And then next event, circle back around. Okay, so I rescued my friend, but then we got ambushed. So now we need to escape, and then that leads to a chase sequence, and you just boom, 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 boom. Event, objective, sequence, So you could look at the Indiana Jones films. There's not that many verbs, right? It's pretty much capture, escape, get object, lose object. And so, we shouldn't be intimidated by thinking that we can actually, homage these kind of structures. Now, there's debates in the industry about whether we should be aping film, to put it in a pejorative sense. But that was our goal, right? Our goal was to make you feel like you played through a beloved film. Not all games obviously would follow the same structure, so this is only useful in that regard. But the goal is to go understand your tropes, understand your verbs, understand your landmarks, and then figure out what the gameplay verb of that is, so that you know what's in your recipe box, right? What's in your toolbox. And then make sure that, because you want ideally to have sort of this perfect pace and propulsion, which is again something we lose when these games get really long because we pad them out, is that you need to make sure those things all fall about in the right places. And again, it also gets back to, like I was saying with the Uncharted games, if you look at them kind of like 22, 25-minute chapters and 45, 55-minute chapters, even the places where you are somewhere for a long time, we tend to cut them in half to go, there's the run-up, and then there's then you get to the destination, and now it's the infiltration of the destination, right? And you'll see the same sort of ramp that you would have in a film, which is sort of like slow infiltration or something, and then it always kind of like ramps up to some sort of big pitched battle or escape sequence, and then that gets us out of the chapter, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, because I was all over the map, but it's just understand those structural elements, understand when you're breaking them, and decide if that's better for the game, or try to solve the problem to go, well, we really need a big climactic moment here. Can we put a set piece here? What is that? And how do we make sure we're honoring that in the story as best we can?
Do we have time for one more, or we?
I could be less verbose. I'll turn my verbosity switch down.
No, I think that was a signal that we have to move on, I'm afraid.
The shrug.
I think that's maybe, but it's on your shoulders if you do. So probably time that we call it a day. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Amy. That was fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you. Thank you.